Again in studio, this time about healing, but also about different forms of D language. The D language is actually very complex Hello World forum. It also includes simple forums of community. When you open the D language forum of community together with the coding for a specific simple forum of developers or in studio, you can see the block organizations, even some sort of building the D for the different forms of tool for other site. You'll also see how to build different type of forums. Of course, you can also build the health forums if you want or health blogs. You can also build the different forms of posting on different social media, but that might make zero of the capital. Very important also to build different forms of hubs with the D simple forms of the language. There are a lot of health issues that a lot of hubs have, but it's very important to get involved in better version of D and make contribution to the community together with my foundation and simple forums of security for a better forums of life. Of course, everyone can donate to the organization to provide the better quality for the community. Indeed, you have different forms of instruction also for any type of politic, how to use the site or which button to click, and of course, also for some forums of the health. Of course, anyone in any sector can also decide for themselves how they want to use different things. But if you are not expert in coding or programming, maybe also better to follow the guide. It's very important to see different forms of arrays around the Europe and around the America and to build the better statements together with D to build also the better apps that are not related to politics. If politics look for apps, that is 100% their problem and not the problems of developers. There exist different interfaces, and each interface, of course, can cover different forms of any government or providing site for them. But of course, it's very important that interfaces are not related to any type of politics and are actually applications. To build the software, it's very important so you can also build a better interface. There are different enums and different type of qualifiers in the D. In the D, you can also find the different forms of poor health functions and also different forms of special case that maybe different forms of face of book have, but it's really related to different forms of simple form cosmetics. The pure factory of cosmetics is not easy. Sometimes you might think we all live in two worlds and it's not part of real world at all. It's very important to understand lazy out ref return scope, const immutable return scope, shared, and different forms of defunctions, but of course those type are not perfect. In simple form of microends, we might use the basic. The basic is very important, but it builds software and not application because software is actually more pure and clean. It's very important to build pure versions and not to think too much about different forms of applications. If you are too much specific, of course, you can also destroy health. And it's very important to understand the general terms in life. It's very important to understand functions in D, but it's also very important to understand different forms of standards. The International Accounting Standard EAS 16 is also the standard of any type of property, or if you want to have the property to build a clinic together with the book. It's very important to understand different forms of failure that come with politics or with property also, and sometimes the coding is the best. It's very important also to have different forms of equipment, and of course, that equipment might be the sound. You might think the sound is really something special, but you should see the sound as something not only imagination, but just noise. It's really a frequency that you deliver to the world or to your city. There are a lot of forms of a set that you can build together with the code. And of course, that code become simple form of the site for politics. There are preconditions for any forms of the government together with the code. The process, of course, can happen all around the world, and some processes are also evil, and that's why it's actually very important to type some simple forums in code, not to corrupt the world but to build better void together with pure forums for everyone. There are different forms of statement that every human can make to prevent any type of disease. The code actually become very simple if you understand it. If you do not understand it, of course, that's a soft problem. And there are a lot of soft problems in 2020. As you also see, if you are going to observe 2020, not to be against any company, but of course, if those company also have problems with different forms of the code, it's very important to make a statement that you are not involved in any part of the company uh, which are providing different forms of disease. It's very important to build a cure for any type of town and to return to the better code. Returning to the better code, of course, can build better parameters and better functions and also purifications. The purifications in software are extremely important, and without purifications, there is no software. To build more pure code is very important, but if you look together with politics, the code become more weak and there are different forms of errors or mistake. Of course, politics are not simple. It is much better to understand better context together with different forms of hospitals, but also to protect yourself in a simple forum with different forms of programs and defenders. In code, you can actually build different forms of the space and different forms of result together with the struct. But you can also, of course, build simple PR as mentioned in book and also define different forms of the code together with different forms of the function. It's very important to also build special functions for the special areas or special functions for different type of people with the different forms of the class. The different class, of course, are going to pay more for different forms of code, and it's very important to build simple forms of visual, but also simple forms of the void if you are working more with locals, also building the auto functions or different forms of parameter together with the statics. There are different forms of immutable code, but also constants in the code together with the slice or alias. Of course, you can also use the simple forms of Microenz Julia to heal the world or any city you are in. It's actually quite difficult to build very healthy forms of the inputs and outputs and to build peace in world. That's not easy because every time you think about any forums of the bank, the world looks like a war. It's very important to be it's very important to make some sort of statements that are actually qualifying together with the simple forms of banking and the void together with the code for community, of course, can build different forums also for the ledgers. The ledgers are extremely complex and related to blockchains. To look for a better blockchain, it's not easy because the blockchains in the world are very limited. A lot of people who are looking for blockchains, they might think about different forms of the sectors. And there is also the GAS. Of course, that's some sort of the fee in the ledgers. There are millions of different type of blocks together with the different forms of the statements. And there are also different forms of simple forum, also together with the hash. The hash is actually very important and sometimes actually making also some of transaction, but that's not for sure. It's very important also to block some forums or some users not to overspeed the process if you are doing work in the blockchain. The most important is actually to secure the design, and the design is actually very important. Also, if you are building some forms of healthier face together with Bitcoin, it's very important to build different forms of blockchains together with microchains if you are looking for more health or more standardization together with simple form of technology. But it's also important to understand simple form of terminology, and together with different forms of sectors to understand different forms of code, also for property or technical part of property, referencing the architecture, but also simple forms of security and privacy in every area. There are different type of contracts that come along together with the ledgers, but it's very important to understand also electrotechnical standardizations, and 90% of people might never understand that. There is also the organization OASIS, which is actually the structured standard in world or in any city. It's very important to build simple forms of electronics for simple forms of the standards for engineers together. And of course, you can also use different forms of the blockchains. There are a lot of protocols together with different forms of the internet or algorithms, but it's very important to build simple forms of the E together with the transactions which are actually on the secured blockchain. It's very important to build simple form of the work primary together with the blockchains or simple forms of the microchains together with the Bitcoin. To understand simple form of the price, it's not easy. The 25% is actually also 23% or 28%, so it's not always 25%. The 25% can also fall down till 21% sometime, and it can also go up till 29% sometime. It depends what type of the technology someone is ordering. According to Microen's simple standard, it's not easy to understand those 25% because sometimes these transactions are actually going much lower on 21% of the industry. But of course, also depends what type of industry you are thinking about. Sometimes not everything it's in on messengers, sometimes not everything it's in apps, sometimes not everything it's on the internet, but it's actually more real life simplified sectors. It's important to understand concurrency and different forms of digital assets. Also, together with the different forms of discussions for different forms automation automatizations, it's very important to understand simple forms of IBM standards also because they also have some standards together with the currency. To know NFTs, those are actually the N, the F, and T are the tokens. That means non fungible tokens and are actually quite complex. It's not easy to understand everything together with the technology. Also, building security in health sectors or building more pure code. To build different blocks is actually very important, but also to have certifications in microchains for a healthier life in any city. To know crypto, you must also know the book Crystal. Inside of the Crystal, there are different forms of simple form protocols together with the art. And to be different in software is sometimes the most important, not to repeat 2020 or what the biggest five companies actually did to the industry. It's important not to mention too much the big companies because, of course, they are not guilty of everything. They are just living the simple forms of the crypto industry. The working for the world or for any city is not simple because your city actually is your world. That's where you are living in to build better patents together with the United States for the health, it's important. The TM is actually simple trademark and it can also build better trademarks for any type of the cosmetics or the face products to build a better picture together with the logic of different forms of community. It's not easy. And people that are developing anything should actually think about better applications, which is of course not easy, but applications sometimes are actually just the products that are behind those industry. The music, of course, it's very hard to think that could heal everything, but some people that are in that type of art also think that music is very important together with the films. The films, of course, are extremely complex, like music is extremely complex, and it's not the topic here. To understand the D is actually very, very difficult. The D are some sort of protocols, and those protocols can build better health. Those protocols can build better syntax. Those protocols in D could not build better software because the software is actually more made on basic and simple forms of micro and Linux and together with micro and Phil, but actually also the combination of both together with C++. There are different forms of the formats, but also how different forms of films actually explained why everything we know about the communication or information are actually wrong together with the biggest five company, and why it's very important to build millions of startups or just one startup and to build it really well. It's very important to build different forms of simple forums to exchange different forms of protocols, and those protocols actually build the different forms of coding layers together with the better and better software. The better software are just better institute for the better simple forms of city, and that city, of course, could not control the whole world because some parts of world could not afford software, and that's actually sad. Do not live in dreaming or in illusion that internet is going to heal all the design or it's going to build better standards for everyone or for poor and rich. It's very important to understand the layer of yourself, but also the code transformations that are going together with the service or product to build a better service and better control, to build a better control for the health, and to build a better lawyers. That's actually very important. There are different forms of the protocols that come together with the D, also the electronic simple TM protocols to building better patents. Of course, you can also do different forms of simple transfer together with crypto or the file together with different forms of the book. There are different forms of the internet protocols, but are actually quite corrupted. So it's actually very important to build better software, and the software can actually also heal if you use also Tao in software. To understand different forms of herbs and different forms of tea, there are millions of tea around the world. So you see, the tea is also healing the people, but of course, a lot of people forget on that and do not use it. To understand the web service is very complex and usually very, very difficult area. Different forms of scientists, of course, do not understand the networks, but they are more social and, of course, they could make a lot of mistakes. The coding together with the optimization in harmony is actually very important also to sense a better balance. A better theory sometimes just build a better science, better world, or better city. Sometimes the city is actually very important and where you live in to understand simple form of environment and also better telecommunications. The science actually is very complex when it comes together with the code because the scientific explanations are usually more social and biological. That's of course a little bit strange and me might have a lot of different forms how to build different forms of lawyers to build without the science because sometimes science could be also corrupted. That's actually a problem, but of course do not take anything personal in science world. There are millions of professionals in science world that they know the best what is the best together with the science. Me is only simple forms of the chat together with the technology in networking to explain different forms of communities and also to see and others to see how the communities are functions. We together are just strangers and nothing more. To understand a better coding together with your profile can also build better health, but sometimes also destroy health. So that's actually sort of a problem. To build a good digital identity is actually explained in my book together with the Robert. That identity is extremely fiction, but also difficult to explain for any scientist. To understand different forms of the law together with the code is 100% fiction. And sometimes it's very important to understand also how with code you can build different forms of the profiles. The D language is simple but can also become very complex. So if you are building more and more D language, you must make self-theorems. What is possible for you to build with D language and what things you are still accepting.